What's up, everyone? I'm Catherine Rudder, and you're listening to Life in the Fast Chain. Or you are watching. On this episode, we have Kieran McGonigal from ISDA and Jason Rosovsky from R3 talking about what ISDA is doing in the space and governance and standardization. A lot of things I personally don't think about on the day-to-day, but it is very interesting to learn about from Kieran and Jason because they are so close to it. And they recently wrote a paper that you can see in the bio of this episode. I vowed to them that I would read it, and it sounds like I'll be able to digest it with my limited knowledge on the topic, but everyone should read it if you're interested. I learned a lot on this episode, and they were just a good hang. I'm so happy to get full episodes out there in this new normal, and hopefully I can get a bunch out there in the next few weeks. So enjoy. On the line with Kieran McGonigal and Jason Rosovsky from R3. Kieran, you're from ISDA. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Yeah.
Just in case, Kieran, you didn't know your company, I just reminded you. So before we get really into it, where are you guys dialing in from today?
So I'm from New York, in Manhattan at the moment.
I am too. We should have done this together, socially distanced. Kieran, where are you dialing in from?
Yeah, so I'm in a town called Colchester, which is about 60 miles or so northeast of London. So we usually work in the London office, but obviously been stuck out here for the last 5 months.
How have you been doing quarantining?
It's been okay. I mean, I guess like everybody's had their own particular challenges. I have 2 kids under 5-year-olds, so a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old boy. So that's been interesting, shall we say, for the past 5 months. I have a newfound respect for teachers having had to homeschool for a couple of months. Yeah, but no, it's been okay. I mean, I think it's been a struggle for a lot of people, at least. You know, I haven't had a chance to get bored, so I suppose that's one thing.
Yeah, that's true. Do you feel like things are getting a little bit better over there?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of work, like the first month or so was quite interesting because I suppose nobody's ever really faced anything like this before. So, we were getting, a lot of questions from our members around a lot of very novel issues. So things like, I'm working at home, I can't print out a document. Can I electronically sign something? How do I send a notice to a company in London if the entire city's locked down? And it's like, nobody's ever had to think about this before. So the first few weeks were interesting, but it seems to have calmed down. I mean, professionally, it seems to have calmed down, and it seems as though things are pretty much back to business as usual.
That's good. Jason, how have you been? Have you been in Manhattan the whole time?
Yeah, I mean, I've taken as many trips out of town as possible. Got another one coming up, but yeah, I mean, generally it's been either home or Central Park, frankly, and I probably have made Central Park my second home at this point.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah,
that's nice.
Yeah.
I just got back to Manhattan after avoiding it for a few months, and it is kind of it's interesting. It's like when I was in a small town where if you're around your property or whatever, you weren't wearing a mask, but everyone's very, very good about wearing masks in public places. And here it's like, if you look like your mask isn't like fully on, I feel like people look at you like, hey, in like the New York fashion. But things are opening up. So it's nice. I went to dinner last night for the first time in a while, which was nice. Feeling like,
yeah, I hope this is one of those changes that stays long term.
Yeah, definitely. And work
outdoor dining. Yeah.
Oh, but what's going to happen when we can't be outside and it's cold? I don't know. Anyways, I can't stress out about the future because I'm stressed enough about the present. But okay, so let's get into it. First and foremost, can you, Kieran, tell us what is ISDA?
Yeah, so ISDA is short for, or it's an acronym for, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. And we are a trade association that represent market participants in the derivatives industry, so very appropriate name. We have around 900 or just over 900 members globally. And that ranges from, as you might expect, the big investment banks, asset managers, pension funds, insurance companies, all the way to corporates, supranationals, anybody essentially uses derivatives or participates in the derivatives market. And among the things that we do, I suppose ISDA's traditional role, or probably what we're best known for, is as a somewhat of a standard setting body. So traditionally, I think ISDA was originally set up to develop and promulgate legal and documentation standards. So we're probably most famous for, or most renowned for, the ISDA Master Agreement, which is the market standard documentation that effectively anybody who trades derivatives more than likely enters into. So that was designed and intended to try and, I suppose, promote the growth of the market by allowing people to sign up to industry standard terms, which then they could negotiate and customize based on their own commercial circumstances, etc. And over time, we've really built on that. So, more documentation, legal opinions to support the legal enforceability of that documentation. We have a policy team. We do conferences to educate our members on developments. And since 2009, 2010, since sort of the fallout from the financial crisis and a lot of the regulatory reforms that we've seen in the market following the G20 global financial regulatory initiatives, our role has expanded, I think, quite considerably, it's fair to say. So that's obviously required a lot more documentation, a lot more contracts to address and cater for regulatory changes in our industry. So mandatory clearing, reporting of transactions, collateral, things like that. But also in other areas, so capital reform, technology is a big emerging issue for us as well, as we'll talk about. So that's really ISDA, not quite in a nutshell, but a brief overview of our over 30 year history.
No, it's very helpful. So, Jason, how do we work with ISDA? Why are we here?
Yeah, no, so I think a lot of kind of the mission of ISDA, it really falls squarely within a complementary role to blockchain, right? So, as Kieran mentioned, right, ISDA's main goal has been around standardization, right? And I think, in a lot of ways, the reason why blockchain, has kind of taken grip in a lot of ways is because, all of these independent institutions for so many years have built up their independent, technology stacks, right? And so blockchain is meant to be kind of that bridge across those technology stacks. And I think, what ISDA does really is do it in a interesting kind of framework, right, for what they do. And so, we've been working with them on thinking through these standards, right? So, and I'm sure Kieran could kind of touch on this, ISDA's put out smart contract guidelines for developers, which we've contributed to. We also kind of, one of the main focuses of today should be around the paper that we put out with ISDA alongside Clifford Chance and the Singapore Academy of Law, which I think actually answers some very novel questions about how you would enforce derivatives transactions on a blockchain platform. And so I think, kind of that framework and that standardization is really goes hand in hand with what we do. And I think, that's why we're so excited to really work with them.
Yeah, totally. So we're going to talk about the paper, but first, Kieran, can you talk a little bit about those smart contracts, like what you guys have done?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, I joined ISDA actually 3 years ago, almost to the week. And when I joined, I think we were just starting our thinking, or to develop our thinking around how blockchain, DLT, how smart contracts might be used in our industry. And I think, derivatives as an industry is quite well suited to the application of technology like blockchain and like smart contracts. I mean, if you look at sort of the economic terms, for example, of a derivatives transaction, they're all fairly operational in nature. You determine the payout of a derivative by reference to an external data source. You perform a calculation. You determine that X is due to Y on a particular date. It lends itself well to the representation of that kind of logic within computer code. Similarly, I think as Jason mentioned, I think a lot of the issues that we have, or that ISDA traditionally faced and tried to solve in terms of standardization and documentation, are things that we are increasingly looking at in other areas as well. So thinking about technology and process, essentially how do people implement and reflect their derivatives transactions within their own technology infrastructure? Firms tend to have their own individual representations of trades. So, I'll enter into a contract with you. We'll take the terms away. We'll implement them into our systems. We'll probably implement them very differently, using different terminology, using potentially different code, different types of systems. When there's a break or a dispute or some kind of an issue and we look to attempt to reconcile our data, it's going to be different. There's also a disconnect between the processes and the contract. So the implementation of the transaction is, as a result, ever only really going to be an approximation of the contractual terms that you've signed up to. So if you put DLT into the equation, you think about how does DLT solve that? If firms are working with a common representation of the data, you all agree on the sort of the golden source of the data, and you use that as the base and as the foundation for developing other technology solutions, whether that's executable smart contracts, AI, or whatever, you're in a much better place. I think another aspect of, sorry, Jason, go ahead.
No, but, and I think it kind of makes sense to kind of drill down a little bit, right? So you say smart contracts. And I know in a lot of your papers, you also talk about smart legal contracts. Do you want to kind of briefly touch on kind of what the distinction is and why that's important for?
Ooh, yeah. Thank you. Good question.
Here we go. This is the good question. This is the number one question. So, as a trade association, we don't take a view. We're technology agnostic. Other platforms, other smart contracts are available. But, the view that we take when we talk about smart derivatives contracts, what we're really talking about is automation. So the automation either of the contract itself or some kind of process which derives from the contract. So, to a technology developer, I guess a smart contract is a piece of executable code that sits on a blockchain platform, not necessarily a blockchain platform, but most likely. Whereas to a lawyer, the word contract obviously evokes, different types of things. So I suppose for us, when we think about smart contract, we're talking about the legal contract itself. So we're talking about smart legal contracts as the industry understands it. And we're talking about, in the derivatives context, taking certain aspects of that contract and automating it so it may be a payment obligation. So I will pay you, X on a given date. That could be automated, and it could be automated in potentially two different ways. It could be automated through the development and implementation of executable code within a process. And, the contract remains much the same as it does today, written in natural language form. Or a more advanced application of that potentially might be to take the contract itself, remove the natural language, and actually have the contractual obligation written in code, which is more advanced. And there are different schools of thought as to where we'll end up. But it's an interesting debate, and I think it's a debate, Jason, that we've been having, or a discussion we've been having for certainly all the time I've known you.
Yeah. And I think at least from the R3 perspective, the idea around smart contracts has always been kind of an integration, right? And I think that's another point of where there's kind of a complementary, kind of aspect of the relationship. It's because of that fact, right? It's when you build a platform from the ground up and you want to take in legal considerations and regulatory considerations, you want to make sure that what you're creating are going to be binding and enforceable contractual obligations.
Yeah.
And as of today, that would have to be, at least an integration between, the code and the natural language, which really, frankly, was the basis for Corda in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk about the paper, because it's getting a lot of buzz. Can you give some background, and then I'll obviously link to it in the bio of this episode for people who actually want to read it.
Yeah, so I think the kind of the genesis of the paper, and we've done a few papers over the years, kind of targeted at some of those questions that we just discussed. So, as a smart contract and enforceable contract, how do you develop a smart contract in practical terms? So, this took a slightly different tack, this paper. So, I suppose there's an inherent challenge with any kind of technology that seeks to decentralize or disintermediate existing, trading relationships and trading infrastructures. And that is, I suppose, when you look at the more technically advanced or technologically advanced applications of DLT and in certain types of platform, there may be some doubt or some uncertainty as to where people are based. So if you have a completely decentralized permissionless blockchain system where you have anonymous or pseudonymous participants on the platform, and where you have assets that are completely digitized and dematerialized, kind of flowing among those parties, and something goes wrong, who do you sue? How do you sue them? And once I sue and win, how do I get my assets back? Where are they? So these are all, I think, really interesting. I mean, interesting, it's all relative, interesting for lawyers, but interesting questions nonetheless.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I think so. So the paper that we did, I mean, one of the things that we're really keen to do is always is to anchor all of this stuff in a very practical application. So, we're not academics, we're not theorizing here, we're looking at practical things. So the paper looked at a couple of different scenarios, a couple of different hypothetical implications of a smart contract on Corda, and looked at a couple of different aspects. So one was, we're trading a derivative on Corda. We decide that we want the contract to be governed by English law. Jason's in New York, I'm in England. If there's a dispute, is there any issues there? Can we still, is it still legally certain that our dispute would be, governed by English law? And I think, it would be. I think it's not wanting to give you any spoilers if you haven't read the paper, but there you go. The other issue, which I think is the more interesting and the more novel, is around the assets. So let's say Jason's in New York, I am in London, there's a dispute, I've posted him $100 of tokenized assets, and I look to recover that $100 from him. Where are they based? And I think the answer to that question really depends on the platform itself. So something like Corda, I mean, Jason will go into this, there really aren't any problems just given the characteristics and the features of the platform. Something like, Bitcoin, where, the assets are essentially strings of code located on a server in Siberia somewhere. I think that's quite challenging. Who do you go to enforce to get your money back, essentially? And I think that's sort of the area that we identified as being something that is uncertain and probably requires some action at an international level.
Yeah, and I think kind of going off that point, the key word here is governance, right? Yeah. And so how do you govern these transactions? How do you what rule set, do you agree upon before you even enter into the transaction, right? And I think that's kind of, one of the key, focal points of what it is that, I think the paper was trying to get into was, if you agree on things before they happen, then you know how to resolve disputes as they arise, right? Yeah. And so, I think that's kind of one of the benefits of the Corda system, frankly, in this scenario, is that you have these agreements that you enter into to get onto the platform to begin with, right? And so you start creating these kind of contractual hierarchies, right? And so as transactions happen, you can look to a contract for the transaction, that if there's an issue with the code, right? If there's a dispute that's beyond that, you could look to the contract you got to enter into the platform. If there are standards or something else that you're integrating, you could look to those. And so I think, the purpose, and a lot of where, this is exciting, I think, is because you're thinking about these rule sets and realizing that you could structure rule sets. And I think, the work that ISDA did here was, incredibly important because, that's one of the first things that lawyers ask is, how do you resolve a dispute and what law governs, right? And when you answer that as kind of the first step, there's just so many things that kind of flow from that.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that came out of this is we think of these issues as novel, and they are. I mean, we're dealing with very new and innovative technology, but in a legal sense, I mean, there isn't really there's nothing new that isn't old, as my mother would say. So we were at on this issue of where are assets located for legal reasons. We were at an ISDA conference, I think, Jason, and was it last year, perhaps the year before, losing track of time. And we were talking about, there's no certainty here. We've never addressed this issue before. It's completely novel. We're at the frontier here. And somebody puts their hand up and they're like, no, actually, we looked at this exact same issue 20 years ago when we were doing I think it was the Cape Town Convention on kind of property rights in space. And we were like, well, we thought about where's a spacecraft that's located in geostationary orbit above the Earth? Where is that located for legal reasons? How do you take security over that? So there's always stuff you can learn from. So I suppose here space law is an inspiration that we can perhaps draw upon for our work.
This is really cool. I will say for some, it's not just like a novel, interesting. I find this very interesting because it's also something, since you guys deal with this stuff every day, like I don't really think about this as much. So it is actually really cool to think about these things because obviously governance is a huge question in this like new world that we're kind of jumping into. Jason, you've talked to me before about how the Corda Network governance is kind of similar. Can you talk about Corda Network and how that all kind of relates?
Sure. Before we go there, though, I think there's a second part of this paper, which fun fact, which I think is actually just as interesting, at least from my perspective.
Right. Let's see.
And so the paper addressed two things, right? The first is obviously this, choice of law. How do you, address issues when they arise? Mm-hmm. And there's a second question posed, which is an issue has arisen. How do you now remediate? Okay. And so in the paper, we took kind of a real example, which was, a token was sent to the wrong party. Okay. And there is now a court order out there. And a judge has said, you have to remediate this, right? These tokens that were with the wrong party have to be with the right party. Okay. Yeah. So the question is, if this is meant to be immutable, how do you solve for that, right? Yeah. And what's interesting is we kind of went through and came up with, I think, a very interesting solution to this. Frankly, because in Corda you have distinctions between the notary and the node, and who's validating and who's using and who's issuing assets. And so, again, provided this is all in the governance, which I think is kind of the keyword here, in the platform that you enter into, the idea is that you can serve the court order onto all the participants on the platform, right? So the notary now knows that it should no longer validate the tokens that were incorrectly sent, right? Mm-hmm. So essentially the person that has them can no longer forward them on. Okay. But now you also ensure that the issuer of the tokens sends them to the right party, right? Mm-hmm. And the notary now knows that those are in fact accurate, right? Okay. And so if they're incorrectly sent and now you want to remediate that error, you have a means of doing that, right? So I think it the paper addresses both the before you enter into the platform, how do you resolve disputes? And then also, if a dispute happens, how do you technologically implement that? And I think that's probably the second piece of that I felt was interesting.
I thought you were going to say the second interesting thing with the PowerPoint diagrams that I put together. I thought they were. I thought that was a given. To be fair, yeah. ISDA and Kieran put together very succinct and precise diagrams that really really show what needs to happen. Perfect. Your tokens are in the post.
Well, so for a lay person like me who doesn't know all of this information, because I have not yet read the paper, would I be able to understand and like the paper just from someone who's like not in this world? I
think so. Yeah. I think, and I think, especially if you look at the diagrams, frankly,
Oh, well, that's a good point.
Of course.
You'll see it all. But no, I think, especially when you kind of get to this, I think there's some kind of level of understanding you need to get to, but, that's why I would also say read all the other ISDA papers, because they all lay the foundation for this kind of step by step.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's no getting away from it. It's a technical area of law. It is, somewhat academic, despite our best intentions. There are over 100 footnotes, for example. Wow. But yeah, I mean, as I said, like a lot of the things that we try and do, we try and make sure it is as practical as possible. So it is does use real life examples. It does, to the extent possible, try and anchor all of this in reality. So yeah.
Yeah.
When you read it, and let us know.
I will. I'll report back. Well, on this page, I was extremely lost, but other than that, yeah, it does sound very interesting, though. But like even from someone who's not in that world, kind of thinking through these things. Yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah. But it's an interesting question. I mean, it's an interesting point. It's like one of the challenges I think certainly that I've faced having come to this a couple of years ago is bridging that gap between, because nobody comes to this as an expert in every different aspect. I mean, I don't, I try my best, but I don't understand the nuances of the technology as well as I'd like to. So a lot of it is trying to bridge that gap across, lots of different disciplines, it's interesting, but it leads to, all sorts of, confusions and things, the confusions over what words mean. Like the classic example in our world is the word execute. So for a lawyer, execute means, sign a contract.
Yeah.
To a technology developer, it means execute a piece of code. And, to somebody else, it means something else a little bit.
But I think you hit on a good point before, which is there's so many analogies to be made, right?
Yeah.
Space property aside for a second, there are issues that, financial technology platforms have been, thinking about and dealing with for some time, right? Tokens can be analogized to, whatever it is that they're meant to represent, and how they're represented today, frankly, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are, a lot of analogies that can be made, and I think that's the way forward, right? Yeah. Is you help people understand what the terms that they get today.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Speaking of analogies, back to my question about Corda Network.
What a segue. Fantastic. So with the Corda Network, one of the main goals, and so for, kind of general conversation purposes, the Corda Network is a network for Cord apps to be interoperable. And it's administered by an independent foundation that R3 helped found, that's based out of the Netherlands. And so, the idea there is to allow kind of the users and the members of the Corda Network to also, help govern the Corda Network. So there's an analogy between kind of the shared governance that, we're looking to kind of develop on the Corda Network, especially for the interoperability between applications, right? For the movement of, the dollar from the trade finance Cord app to the insurance Cord app. At that space, you want to have, again, going back to the key word, right? The governance that allows you to know what happens, if something goes wrong, what are the rules you abide by? And frankly, what are the rules if everything goes right? Right.
Yeah.
Which is the ideal goal. And so I think, the analogy there is frankly the frameworks, right? A lot of what we're trying to do, and a lot of what the Corda Network and the foundation, all the entities that are involved there are trying to do is create, this framework for transaction of assets, in a similar way that ISDA has their framework. And so, I think as everything kind of progresses and development and thinking and all that, there's a neat little kind of fit there, between, the software governance stacks and obviously, the contractual frameworks that is together.
Yeah. And, the point about interoperability is a really important one. Earlier this week, ISDA partnered with a number of other trade associations in different markets. And we sent a letter to the Financial Stability Board, ALGO, and the Bank for International Settlements, essentially setting out kind of our view of the future of financial markets, very grand sort of ambitions, a digital future for financial markets. And I think, the interoperability, I think, is the thing that underpinning everything that we set out in that letter. So we talk about, the importance of standards as a foundation for building new technology and implementing it within the markets, the importance of standardization of documents, as we talked about earlier, but also the processes, the digitization of those processes. And I think importantly for us as trade associations, and all of the trade associations that co-signed the letter, is, the importance of ensuring that those standards are interoperable, that they're properly governed, and that they're made available to the markets, as freely as possible. Because, like Jason said, I think, what you don't want as a financial institution is to have, different documents for different business lines and different processes for business lines. If those differences aren't justified, you don't want to have to implement different platforms in each of those businesses. And, particularly as a vendor, you don't want to be going down the street and doing something different and bespoke for every single bank, because, ultimately, take a step back, what are we trying to solve for? We're trying to solve for the inefficiencies and cost stress that that our members and financial institutions are experiencing. If we just end up kind of creating a new swishier technology infrastructure that is not interoperable, that is still complex, that still, that falls over if there's a big issue or big market event, then we haven't really solved the problem. So I think that's a really important point.
Yeah. Kieran, what is the ISDA CDM or common domain model?
Yeah, so the common domain model is, we talked already about standardization, and this is another kind of extension of that. So what CDM is intended to do is to standardize the representation of derivatives trade processes. So anything that can happen in a derivatives transaction through the life cycle of the trade. So payments, novations, terminations, all that kind of thing. And it goes back to the point that we were just talking about around interoperability and the fact that, different firms on the street will have different representations of different aspects of a trade within their system. So the CDM is an attempt to completely kind of harmonize that. So it sets out, a schema or terminology or way of phrasing within the model different life cycle events on a trade by trade basis, albeit it's trade agnostic. To the extent that there's an event within one asset class that can be referred to in the same way in another, that's the approach that we've taken. And, it's a model that's extensible. So, we've covered a number of different derivatives products. We're covering, collateral. We announced this week with ISDA, the International Securities Lending Association, that we're going to be expanding it, or they're going to be working to expand it to cover securities financing transactions as well. So it's this idea of creating this kind of foundation of standards, digitizing those standards, and then using that to allow people to implement solutions on top of it. Very interesting, very exciting for us. In terms of things that we've done with it, we've been speaking to the Bank of England and the FCA on a digital reporting pilot using it. So you can imagine that for regulatory reporting in particular, the regulators expect to receive common expressions of data from all of the different market participants. So CDM really helps towards doing that, ensuring consistency of data output. And then there's other, lots of really interesting applications as well across just trade lifecycle management, but also possibly in the collateral space too, which, in terms of things that you think about within our market as being good candidates for blockchain, for smart contracts, for automation, collateral management is, I think, a really good one. It's very operational. It's very, manually intensive. It has a lot of operational processes baked in there. So, it's we've been developing it for the past couple of years. We're rolling it out. It's open source, so people can go onto the ISDA website, take a look, play around with it if you want. And, for anybody listening who's interested in developing tech solutions based on CDM, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to, to talk about how you guys can get involved.
Cool. Very cool. Thank you for explaining that. So speaking of acronyms, we right now CBDCs are like a hot topic, and I just feel like everyone is kind